Northwest Ordinance that Congress adopted in 1787 said, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress." Funnily enough, only 43 years later, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which is a complete contradiction of the Northwest Ordinance, and it initiated a horrific period for Native Americans. It included wars and the forced relocation and removal of many Native American tribes. Some removal was voluntary, but the majority was forced. Were any Native American tribes successful in keeping their land? We believe that the majority of Native American tribes failed to keep their land, but there was at least one tribe that successfully kept their territory. In 1832, the U.S. government tried to enforce a treaty that demanded the removal of the Sauk people from their Saukanack village. Chief Black Hawk resisted, sparking the Black Hawk War. U.S. troops and Illinois state militia quickly moved in and forced the families to flee. The treaty that followed opened up more land to American settlement and pushed the Sauk and their Meskwaki allies back. Going back in time to 1763, the Ottawa leader named Pontiac entertained the idea of restoring an Indian world. He rejected Americans' ways and wielded a union of tribes northwest of the Ohio River. They captured a chain of British forts. The tribes pulled back because of tribal autonomy, because they didn't have an organized supply line, and they had little opportunity to live off the land. When their provisions ran out, they had no choice but to return to their homes. The Comanche tribe resisted American expansion, and after fighting and losing, they signed the Treaty of Medicine Lodge and moved on to a reservation. Time and time again, tribes resisted and fought, lost, and forced to sign a treaty giving away their land, and moved on to a reservation. Some of these tribes were the Kagiya, Kickapoo, who were scattered after losing their land, Mi'kmaq, and Mohawk tribes. The Maliseet not only lost their land, but their names were changed and the majority of them became Christians.
However, there were a few different circumstances for a few tribes, namely the Creeks and Seminoles. Creek chief Alexander McGalvray negotiated a treaty in March 1832, which gave Americans a large portion of their land, but guaranteed them protected ownership of the remaining land. Unfortunately, this didn't last long. The Secretary of War ordered the removal of Creeks as a military necessity. By 1837, about 15,000 Creeks had been pushed westward. They never did sign a removal treaty. The biggest resistance was from the Seminoles who lived in Florida. The English called them Seminoles, but their actual name was Yat Seminoli, meaning free people, because for thousands of years they had resisted the Spaniards and English attempts to take their land. The resistance led to the First Seminole War, which Andrew Jackson marched across Florida's borders and burned Indian towns, captured Africans who were aiding the Seminoles, hung a Muskogee man, as well as 2 Englishmen who he believed had helped the Indians. The U.S. government also held meetings that tried to convince not only the Seminoles, but other tribes in Florida to sell their cattle and pigs, return runaway slaves, vacate their land, and move west into Arkansas Territory. This apparently didn't go well, since the Second Seminole War happened 2 years later in 1835. The U.S. committed almost $40 million and 1,500 soldiers to the forced removal of roughly 3,000 Muskogee Indians into Oklahoma. The Third Seminole War took place from 1856 to 1858. The Seminole people were hunted with bloodhounds, rounded up, and forced into ships that took them to New Orleans. Many military figures attempted to remove the Seminoles from Florida, such as Edmund P. Gaines, Zachary Taylor, who later becomes president, and Oliver O. Howard. The military tried to fight the Seminoles, but they were in a place that favored the Native Americans. Malaria and dysentery were the main rewards for the U.S. troops that tried to fight in this area. For the next 40 years, the Seminoles survived wars and endured difficulties related to their resisted removal. But by the end of the 19th century, relations with the Americans improved. During the first half of the 20th century, the tribe had regained 80,000 acres of land from the U.S. government. For the next 50 years, the tribe developed various economic programs, and now there are an estimated 27,000 people of Seminole descent. Overall, most Native American tribes were unable to maintain any of their land at all. One of the only exceptions was the few remaining Seminoles that kept their land in Florida. Although many tribes fought and resisted, only a few of them kept their land. Even though the Northwest Ordinance should have helped prevent any of the Native American battles, the Trail of Tears, and the relocation of the Native American people, it didn't.